The first-class cabin smelled of white leather and warm maple. But at 35,000 feet, it had become a battlefield. A passenger screamed, throwing a designer bag against the partition, demanding a seat she didn't pay for. The cabin lights reflected off polished shoes, glasses of champagne trembling in startled hands. Everyone froze. Heads turned. Phones were already recording. At the center of the chaos stood Clara Bennett, 29, wearing a muted grey hoodie and faded navy joggers. Her hair was pulled back into a simple bun. She looked small, unassuming, like she had just stepped off the subway rather than boarded a private flight. No one knew who she really was. Every eye in first class saw only a young woman in streetwear. No one suspected the woman gripping the edge of her seat was the sole owner of Lumen Air, the airline they were flying the CEO, whose decisions could ground flights and freeze contracts with a single phone call. A flight attendant, a tall woman in her late 30s named Miranda Cole, stepped forward, voice clipped and rehearsed. "Ma'am, that seat is assigned to another passenger. You need to move immediately." Clara did not flinch. She did not speak. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag and met Miranda's gaze evenly. Her dark eyes, calm, unblinking, and dangerous in their stillness. Miranda's fingers tightened on her radio, calling for backup, but her voice faltered just slightly when she glanced at Clara. Something about the woman's posture, the quiet authority in the tilt of her chin, unnerved her. Around them, other passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring, whispering, some lifting phones. A businessman in 3B lowered his newspaper and watched the crease of his brow deepening as the tension thickened. Clara had expected this. She had walked this path before, but not in the sterile world of a first-class cabin. The stakes were higher here. A single misstep would look like defiance, insolence, and ruin her cover. Yet every detail mattered: the tilt of Miranda's head, the way her hand hovered over the call button, the slight hesitation of the white woman, sitting in 1B with platinum status. "Excuse me," the white woman snapped, voice dripping with entitlement. "I paid for this. Move. Now!" Her tone carried the practiced aggression of privilege. She did not see Clara. She did not see the quiet command, the quiet fire, the depth of control in her calm stance. To the others, this was a fight between a rich, entitled passenger and someone who had no business being there. To Clara, it was a test, a measure of how far they would go when confronted with someone they underestimated. Miranda gestured to a second flight attendant, a man named Julian Hayes, 35, slightly younger, lean and tense. He stepped forward, trying to assert authority. "Ma'am, you need to comply. This is company policy." Clara's hand tightened around her seatbelt. She did not argue, but her eyes flicked to Julian's, silently calculating. Every word they spoke, every move revealed weakness, revealed bias. She noted it, storing it. Each gesture was a data point, a small fracture in the world these passengers thought they controlled. Carolyn, the entitled woman, in 1B huffed, flinging her hair back. "I've been flying Lumen Air for 12 years. Platinum, you're in the wrong cabin." "Do you understand me?" Her diamond bracelet caught the cabin lights, flickering with every movement. She did not see Clara's hand slide subtly into her pocket, tapping a secure app, summoning a message that would verify the truth within minutes. A tense silence fell. Miranda's mouth opened and closed, as if rehearsing words she had used hundreds of times in similar situations. Julian shifted from foot to foot. The other passengers leaned forward, sensing the unease but not fully understanding it. Everyone could feel it, the electricity in the cabin, the quiet that preceded a storm. Clara inhaled slowly, letting her calm radiate outward. The subtle shift was perceptible to those attuned, the teenager filming on the aisle, the older couple clutching a travel bag, the businessman whose fingers tapped against the polished tray table, the stewardess adjusting her scarf with nervous precision. Each person observed, judged, reacted, but none could see the depth of power Clara held. "Step aside, please, Julian," commanded, moving closer. He did not notice the slight shift in Clara's shoulders, the way her eyes flicked toward the emergency exit sign, calculating escape, observing the layout, noticing the subtle imbalance in authority among the crew. A flight attendant from the rear cabin called forward, her voice quivering. "Captain, there's a disturbance in first class. Passenger refuses to move." The words sounded normal, professional, but they carried the subtle undertone of panic. Clara did not respond. She leaned back in her seat, slightly breathing shallowly, but evenly, her presence calm and deliberate. Each movement was cinematic. The camera of a phone tilted subtly toward her, caught the flash of a platinum card in Carolyn's hand, her smirk faltering for the first time. "Excuse me," Carolyn said again, louder, almost yelling now. "You can't sit here. This is my seat. I have senior status. I've flown this route more times than you can imagine." Her words hung in the air, brittle and sharp. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained composed. She leaned forward just enough for the passengers nearby to catch the faint smirk of someone who knew a secret they did not. "Are you sure about that?" she asked softly. Not a challenge, but an anchor. Miranda's voice rose. "Ma'am, I need you to comply, or we will have to escalate." Her tone was firm, practiced, designed to intimidate. Julian placed a hand on the back of a seat, preparing for intervention. The cabin held its collective breath. Clara's fingers tapped a quiet rhythm on her armrest. Her assistant's secure message had arrived, confirmation of her ownership, legal authority, and full control of the aircraft. A subtle smile curved across her lips. Not a smile of amusement, but of inevitability. She let the silence stretch, allowing it to press against the nerves of everyone who assumed power over her. Suddenly the door to the cockpit opened. Captain Michael Sanders. 58, broad-shouldered expression carved by decades of experience, stepped out. His eyes swept the cabin, calculating reading. He noted the tension, the carefully staged authority of Miranda, the defiance in Clara's posture. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice calm but authoritative. "We have a seating dispute. I need verification before we can proceed with takeoff." He gestured to the crew. Carolyn's face tightened. She turned toward the captain, voice rising with desperation and anger. "This is my seat. I've been flying here for years. Platinum. I will not move for this." Clara finally spoke. Her voice soft, deliberate, carrying the weight of command and truth. "Captain Sanders, this is my seat. The boarding pass, the registration, the airline itself, they all verify it." The cabin fell completely silent. Phones stopped recording for a moment. The gleam in Clara's eyes was sharp, controlled. She was calm, but everyone felt the weight of her presence, the power they had failed to recognize. Miranda's jaw tightened. Julian's hand trembled slightly. Carolyn's smirk vanished, replaced by disbelief. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. The air itself seemed charged. Clara leaned back slightly, letting the quiet certainty of her authority spread through the rows of first-class seats. No one moved. No one dared. Every ounce of privilege, every ounce of entitlement, suddenly met an unmovable wall. And at that moment, the first subtle twist revealed itself. A young passenger in 3C recording the scene whispered to her mother, "Do you think she's really allowed to sit there?" Her voice trembled, capturing the dawning realization. The cabin had unknowingly witnessed the collision of appearances and true power, and the outcome was only beginning to unfold. Above the hum of the engines, the camera lens of another passenger caught a glint, a discreet platinum emblem on Clara's bag, a hidden signal confirming authority that no one, not even the crew, could challenge. A storm had been set in motion. Victoria's face turned a sharp shade of crimson as she realized the cabin had gone still. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped against the armrest, the sound sharp, impatient. "You can't just sit there," she hissed, leaning forward, trying to project authority. Clara didn't move, didn't flinch, just met her gaze evenly. Her dark eyes calm, but contained a current of quiet power. Around them, the cabin had become a stage. Passengers' frozen phones raised, capturing every subtle twitch of muscle, every flicker of emotion. Miranda Cole cleared her throat and stepped between them, attempting a bridge. "Ma'am, I understand the situation, but I need you to follow instructions. Please move to seat 2B. Her voice was polite, but it carried the unspoken threat of escalation. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying Miranda, as if weighing the measure of her authority. Noting the slight tremor in her voice, the edge of uncertainty masked by a practiced smile. Julian Hayes hovered behind, hands lightly on the back of a chair, ready to intervene. He caught the glance Clara gave him, fleeting but piercing, and for the briefest second he hesitated. Authority in his experience came with respect, and he felt that Clara held it effortlessly, without raising her voice. Victoria's lips pressed together in thin line, and she leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "I've spent more on this flight than most of these people earn in a month. You don't belong here. Move." Her tone was sharp, almost predatory. Clara exhaled slowly, the movement deliberate, visible to those around her. Her gaze swept the cabin, the young couple in 2C, the older man in 3D, the teenager filming at the back. She measured every reaction, every potential ally, every observer, every witness. "You're right," Clara said finally, her voice low measured, carrying just enough for Victoria and the crew to hear. "I don't belong here. You do. That's why I'm staying." The words were almost casual, but they landed like stones. The cabin shivered, as if acknowledging the weight beneath them. A murmur spread quietly through the passengers. Some leaned forward unconsciously, aligning themselves with the defiance in Clara's posture. Phones shifted to capture angles that would make the story viral. In one row, a woman whispered to her husband, "She's not just a passenger, is she?" The question hung in the air, rhetorical, because no one could yet see the truth. Victoria snapped. "Excuse me. Do you think you can talk to me like that? I am a paying customer. Move now." She jabbed a finger toward the exit, as if directing Clara to obey, through sheer force. Miranda stepped in, hand raised, trying to keep control of the unfolding chaos. "Ma'am, please, let's keep this calm. We can find another first-class seat for you." Clara leaned back slightly, letting the implied pause stretch. Her quiet assessment was relentless. Miranda, Julian, the cabin crew, they all carried authority, but none had legitimacy beyond the badge pinned to their chest. Clara's authority was absolute, invisible but palpable. The young woman recording at the back glanced at the display on her phone, wide-eyed, counting viewers climbing rapidly, and whispered to no one in particular. "This isn't just a fight over a seat. This is something else." Victoria's face tightened. She could feel the momentum slipping. The cabin was no longer just her theater. Clara's stillness, the way she occupied her space without aggression, had begun to draw the energy away from Victoria, redirecting the tension in subtle, invisible ways. The crew noticed Miranda's hand twitched toward the radio. Julian adjusted his stance, but neither dared step closer. Clara did not move, did not speak. She simply exuded presence. Then the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants began their pre-flight announcements. The shift was subtle, cinematic. Every reflection off glassware, every polished leather armrest became part of the tableau. Clara's gaze moved to the small panel above her seat, checking her watch timing every heartbeat, measuring the passage of time down to seconds. Victoria leaned back slightly, trying to regroup to assert control. "I've called my assistant. I can have the captain on the line in a minute. You will move." The threat was clear, practiced, designed to intimidate. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, almost imperceptible, and her fingers brushed against the leather strap of her bag. She let the silence stretch long enough for the murmurs to grow into a soft undercurrent. The plane shuddered slightly as passengers shifted. The young woman filming whispered, "Do you think she knows who she's messing with?" The older man beside her glanced over, eyebrows furrowed, sensing that this was no ordinary passenger dispute. The cabin had become a microcosm of society. The entitled, the underestimated, the observers, the silent witnesses, all held in the grip of one contained but powerful confrontation. Miranda moved again, trying a different approach. "Ma'am, I need you to understand the procedure. For safety and security, passengers must comply with seating assignments." Her words were precise, rehearsed, authoritative. Clara nodded slightly, acknowledging the attempt at logic. "I understand the procedure," she said. Voice calm, but procedure is not the same as truth. Julian stepped closer, tension in his shoulders. "Ma'am, you need to cooperate. We have other passengers to accommodate. If you refuse..." He did not finish. The threat hung in the air incomplete because he understood that the word refuse here was meaningless. Clara's calm authority had made it meaningless. Victoria's face reddened, her composure cracking. She leaned forward, voice rising. "You have no right. I've flown this route more times than you've been alive. I have status. I have money. You will not stay there," she jabbed toward the aisle. A few passengers flinched. Others whispered, some recording, some staring, the pressure mounting like heat rising in the cabin. Clara's response was measured, almost cold. "You underestimate the room," she said, softly. "You underestimate what sits beneath appearances." She leaned forward just slightly enough for Victoria to catch the weight of her presence. It was not a threat. It was certainty. Miranda swallowed hard, noticing for the first time the subtle shift. Julian's eyes flicked to the back, counting the number of phones, noting the growing digital audience. The live stream count had already crossed 2,000. Victoria's smirk faltered as the ripple of recognition began to reach the passengers. Everyone felt it, even if they didn't yet understand why. The cabin door cracked open. Captain Edward Grant, 60 silver at the temples, broad-shouldered, stepped into view. His eyes scanned the scene, registering tension, authority, and disorder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. Voice steady. "We have a seating dispute. I need verification before we can proceed with takeoff." He gestured to Miranda, who nodded, hand hovering near the radio. Victoria seized the moment. "Captain, this is my seat. I've been flying Lumen Air for over a decade. This woman is refusing to comply." She gestured toward Clara. Voice sharp, eyes wide with indignation. Clara finally spoke. Voice calm, controlled, and sharp as steel. "Captain Grant, this is my seat. Boarding pass, registration, airline records. They all confirm it." She placed her boarding pass neatly on the tray table, her movements deliberate, cinematic. The cabin went silent. Phones froze mid-record, mouths opened slightly. Whispers vanished. The passengers could feel it. Something was shifting. The balance of power previously assumed had reversed. Authority, status, wealth, none mattered compared to the certainty emanating from Clara's stillness. Victoria's jaw dropped the first real crack in her composure. Miranda and Julian exchanged glances, both realizing that the situation had exceeded their training, their authority, and their expectations. The passengers leaned forward, unspoken understanding passing between them. The young woman recording whispered into her headset, "Oh my God, she's the CEO." Clara's eyes swept the cabin once more, taking in every gaze, every subtle movement, every raised phone, every flinch of those who had assumed superiority. And with that, the subtle prelude ended. The storm had only just begun, but the tide had already turned. The cabin no longer belonged to the entitled. It belonged to the woman everyone had underestimated. Victoria's face went pale the moment Clara's words hung in the cabin. Her platinum bracelet caught the light, flashing like an alarm that she was losing control. She leaned forward, voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "You're lying. You can't possibly be the owner. I've flown this airline for 12 years. I know the people who run this place." This isn't." Her sentence fractured, swallowed by the sudden awareness in the cabin. Clara's gaze didn't waver. She lifted a finger slowly and pressed the touchscreen of her tablet. A digital display lit up, showing corporate records, flight manifests, and her name stamped across every official line: Clara Kingston, CEO and majority shareholder of Sovereign Airways. The glow reflected in the eyes of passengers and crew alike. Phones clicked, streams multiplied. Every passenger who had been watching the confrontation in shock now had clarity. Miranda Cole's hands shook slightly. She had been certain of her authority, of her role in managing first-class protocol. But suddenly, every command she had given felt trivial, fragile. Julian Hayes stepped back, jaw tight, acknowledging without words the impossibility of the situation. Carolyn's smirk vanished completely. Her confident posture crumpled into disbelief, her sharp inhale audible as she realized the woman she had tried to humiliate was the one who could ground her entire travel itinerary with a single phone call. "You, Victoria," began her voice, low, venomous. "You're just a—" She stopped, searching for words that would assert dominance, but the room swallowed them. Clara's presence was absolute. "I am the person you've been fighting without knowing it," Clara said evenly. She leaned back into her seat, voice calm, measured, carrying the authority of someone who had seen the world bend to her decisions. "You took what you assumed was yours. That seat, this cabin, this flight, you never owned any of it. But I do." The cabin air thickened. A subtle tension threaded through the rows of leather seats. Passengers who had been holding their breath for the previous 10 minutes now sat straighter, some whispering in awe, others cautiously smiling at Clara, some adjusting phones to capture what they knew would go viral. Victoria's face contorted with rage and panic. You can't do this!" "I demand." She broke off. Her platinum card rattled in her hand. "I demand a refund. I demand compensation. This is outrageous." Her voice rose sharp and piercing, but Clara did not react. The calm control emanating from her seemed to absorb the chaos. Miranda tried again. "Ma'am, I mean, Mrs. St. James, we can—" But Clara's gaze swept over her icy and unflinching, cutting off the sentence mid-air. "You will do nothing. This cabin, this flight, and the crew will operate according to the rules of the airline I own. That is all you need to know." Julian moved closer to assist, but a subtle tilt of Clara's head made him pause. He realized she did not need allies. She did not need loud commands. Her presence alone was enough. Passengers began to speak in hushed tones. One elderly man in row 3 whispered, "I never thought I'd see the owner confront a passenger directly like that." A woman in 4C nodded, adjusting her scarf. "I've flown hundreds of times and never did I see someone move the entire cabin like that, with just her presence." Carolyn finally spoke, her voice cracking. You can't. She stopped, realizing that her threats carried no weight here. Her entitlement had evaporated in the glow of authority. "I've been flying first class for years. Platinum. You don't." Her hand tightened around the armrest, knuckles white. "You don't even look like." Clara leaned slightly forward, eyes meeting hers, and her voice dropped to a quiet, lethal calm. "I do not care what you think I look like. What matters is this: I hold the power you assumed you had. Your money, your status, your platinum card. None of it can override the authority of ownership. You attempted to humiliate me. You failed." Miranda and Julian exchanged glances. Miranda's hand hovered over the radio, hesitant. Julian's jaw clenched. Both understood they had been caught in the crossfire of something far beyond their usual operational concerns. This was no longer protocol, it was reckoning. Victoria stumbled backward, slightly, eyes darting around the cabin, searching for support. She found none. Every passenger was aware now, some hiding smiles, others whispering, some holding phones, steady as streams went live. The power dynamics had shifted entirely. Clara's gaze shifted to the flight attendants, not with blame, but with assessment. "Ensure the remainder of this flight is handled professionally. I want my passengers treated with respect. The rules are clear. Any deviation from safety or protocol will be addressed. Do you understand? Miranda nodded quickly, swallowing her pride. Julian stepped back, exhaling slowly, acknowledging both the authority and the inevitability of the order. Victoria's voice rose again, desperate, panicked. This is illegal. You can't. This is harassment. I paid for this seat. Clara's eyes narrowed, ice cold, a quiet judgment in every line of her face. No. You assumed authority you did not possess. You acted innately. You harassed my crew, and you humiliated a passenger. I am rectifying that now. That is not harassment. It is accountability. The cabin held its collective breath. Even the youngest flight attendant, 22, caught in the aisle, watching the drama unfold, felt the shift. The energy in the room had changed. Power was no longer a facade. It was visible, undeniable, absolute. Victoria's breathing became shallow. She glanced around, seeing every witness, every live stream, every phone recording. The reality sank in. The humiliation she had imposed on someone she thought powerless had now rebounded tenfold. She was vulnerable, exposed, powerless. A subtle click echoed as Clara opened her tablet again, sending a secure message. Within minutes, the airline's operational team would receive full documentation, live streams, crew reports, seating manifests, boarding passes, timestamps, and the legal framework confirming Clara's authority. The weight of consequence was imminent, silent, unyielding. The passengers leaned forward, slightly, a quiet understanding passing between them. The flight had transformed into more than a journey from New York to London. It had become a lesson in perception power and justice. Victoria's lips trembled. She attempted one final appeal, a desperate show of remaining dominance. You're just. Clara tilted her head, a faint, deliberate smirk curving her lips. I am your worst oversight. Her words landed like a hammer. The cabin exhaled collectively. Every observer understood this was a reckoning long in preparation, and they were all witnesses to it. Miranda finally found her voice. Yes, ma'am. Understood. We will proceed according to your instructions. Julian nodded, his posture relaxing slightly, aware that the storm had passed only because it had never been chaotic for Clara. Clara leaned back, closing her eyes briefly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. Her heartbeat remained steady. Her mind, however, raced through contingencies, noting the subtle behaviors of crew and passengers alike. Everything had been observed, everything recorded, everything accounted for. Victoria slumped slightly in her seat. Defeated, her confidence evaporated. She could no longer control the narrative, could no longer project the power she had assumed belonged to her. Every protest, every entitlement had met immovable force. She had been frozen, rendered powerless, not by confrontation, but by undeniable truth. The cabin slowly returned to motion. Drinks were served, bags stowed properly. Passengers settled. Phones lowered. The quiet click of tray tables, the rustle of magazines. The soft hum of the engines resumed. But the energy lingered, electric residual. Everyone aboard had witnessed an upheaval of perception, a demonstration that authority and respect were earned, not assumed. Clara exhaled, letting a small, satisfied smile touch her lips. She had maintained composure, executed authority without drama, and ensured the flight would continue smoothly. Yet in the back of her mind, she began calculating the next steps. Documentation follow-up with the crew, and making certain that accountability would reach every level necessary. Victoria avoided eye contact, lips pressed tight, knowing that the people around her now saw the truth. She had challenged someone she could not see clearly, underestimated the woman sitting calmly, and had been exposed before dozens of witnesses. The lesson was quiet, sharp, inescapable. Passengers glanced at one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others murmuring approval, but all were silent, caught in the aftermath of power revealed. Clara remained seated, hoodie neat tablet resting against her lap, the quiet storm of authority radiating outward. And somewhere in the cabin, the youngest flight attendant exhaled, her eyes bright with a mix of relief and awe. She had seen hierarchy dismantled, authority asserted, and power displayed not with volume or threats, but with precision, calm, and truth. The plane continued its climb, the city lights of New York fading below, while at 35,000 feet, a lesson had been delivered that no one would forget. The engines hummed steadily, a low, constant vibration beneath the cabin floor, but the tension in first class had not eased. Passengers adjusted in their seats, sipping champagne and scanning the rows, but their eyes kept returning to Clara Kingston. She remained in her seat, hands folded lightly over her tablet, observing. Every flick of her gaze, every subtle shift of her body, projected control that no amount of entitlement could disrupt. Victoria St. James had slumped into the window seat beside hers, still clutching her platinum card, still gripping her designer handbag, as if holding on to the last shreds of authority she thought she had. Her mouth moved, forming words, but no sound came. She had nothing left to say that could affect the situation. Every lie, every assumption of superiority had collapsed in the quiet, deliberate force of Clara's presence. Miranda Cole moved through the aisle again, attending to other passengers. But each time she glanced back, her shoulders were tense, her jaw tight. Julian Hayes stood near the front, arms folded, watching the subtle shifts in Clara's posture, recognizing the meticulous precision in her every movement. Even the youngest flight attendant, barely 23, paused in her service notebook in hand, scribbling notes in real time. Clara shifted slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the tray table, and the cameras in the cabin adjusted, capturing the faint movement, magnifying it across the live streams, already buzzing in the hands of passengers. Each tap of her finger on the tablet seemed purposeful, deliberate, measured. She was not merely occupying the seat. She was sending a message. Presence can be authority, and authority can be silent. Victoria tried again. Her voice cracked, trembling now, the first genuine display of panic. You can't be serious. This is about... I've flown first class for years. I know the rules. You're just... She cut herself off, realizing that words would not pierce Clara's composed calm. Clara's eyes flicked to Victoria for the briefest moment, dark and calm, and then returned to the cabin. She leaned forward slightly, voice low, precise, measured. You attempted to assert dominance through entitlement. You failed. This cabin, these passengers, the crew, they will operate according to truth, not assumption. Miranda's lips pressed together. Julian exhaled sharply. Even Carolyn St. James, with all her wealth and status, could feel the weight of Clara's authority pressing down. It was not loud. It did not shout. It simply existed, undeniable, inescapable, and in the quiet it dismantled every false perception of control Victoria had clung to. A young man in row 3 raised his hand, slightly hesitating. "Excuse me," he said. Is she really in charge?" "The owner." His voice was low, tentative. A ripple ran through the cabin. Phones lifted subtly. The murmurs grew a quiet wave of recognition and awe. Passengers began to exchange glances. Even those who had previously cheered for Victoria's side now felt the shift, the invisible pivot of power that had gone unnoticed until this moment. Victoria's face drained of color. She opened her mouth again, seeking to reclaim some semblance of control. "I want to speak to the captain. This is harassment, I demand." Her words faltered under Clara's steady gaze. A calm but imperious tilt of the head told her that no appeal, no declaration could change the outcome. Clara leaned back, voice soft, almost conversational, but sharp enough to cut through the anxiety in the cabin. "Captain Sanders is aware. The boarding manifests the corporate records, the flight operations, they all verify my authority. I am here legally, procedurally, and morally. Nothing else matters." Miranda stepped closer to Victoria, voice shaking slightly. "Ma'am, please, let's keep this calm." The rest of the passengers. Her sentence trailed off. She was aware that words no longer carried power in the presence of Clara's certainty. Julian shifted his weight, glancing at the cabin, feeling the hum of attention and fear radiate outward from the center seat. Victoria's hands trembled around her clutch. "This is impossible. You can't just—" She looked at the passengers, hoping for allies, for witnesses to validate her. But the subtle energy in the cabin had shifted. Every eye that had once followed her entitlement now tracked Clara, absorbing the quiet, relentless power emanating from the young woman in the hoodie and joggers. Clara shifted again, pulling a small leather notebook from her lap, tapping it open with a deliberate, controlled motion. She scribbled a note, slow, deliberate, visible to those who had been watching. The action was mundane but cinematic in its precision. It spoke volumes. She observed, she documented, she controlled. The passengers leaned forward slightly, some whispering, some adjusting their phones, but all aware that this was a moment outside the ordinary flow of travel. Miranda's hand twitched toward the radio, but she hesitated. Julian caught her eye. No one wanted to intervene. The authority in front of them was too absolute. Even the youngest flight attendant stopped mid-step, noting the meticulous posture, the calm, measured breathing, the unspoken command that radiated outward. Victoria's voice rose again, thin and wavering now. This is outrageous. I'm a platinum passenger. You can't." She cut off abruptly as a passenger in row 2 leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I think you should sit down. The documents show she's correct. We're all witnessing this." His tone was quiet, not confrontational but deliberate. A ripple of realization passed through the cabin. Phones lowered for a fraction of a second, then lifted again, capturing every subtle shift, every breath, every glance. Clara's eyes scanned the room, noting each expression, each reaction, silently cataloguing loyalty. Fear, confusion, alignment. She did not flinch. She did not speak beyond what was necessary. The door to the cockpit opened again. Captain Edward Sanders stepped into view. Expression, neutral, voice, steady. "I've been informed of the situation," he said. sweeping the cabin with measured authority. "Please provide documentation for verification." His eyes fell on Clara, noting the quiet command she projected, the calm authority that seemed to suspend the tension in mid-air. Victoria attempted one final push, a desperate surge of entitlement. "Captain, this is harassment." Her words were drowned out by the realization that no one, not crew, not passengers, not even the captain, doubted the facts. Clara's voice remained low, calm, deadly precise. "Captain, everything is verified. Seat assignment, ownership, operational authority. I am here in every legal and procedural sense. The remainder of this flight will proceed according to my direction." Miranda exhaled, shoulders sagging. Julian stepped back, every member of the crew suddenly aware that the rules they had enforced without question had collided with reality. A quiet hum of awareness passed through the cabin. Even the passengers who had been recording for entertainment now watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Victoria's hands clenched the armrest. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for a word, a command, a lifeline. None came. Clara's calm presence, the certainty of her authority, and the subtle projection of control had rendered all attempts at resistance futile. A young flight attendant whispered to Miranda, voice shaking, "I've never seen someone like that," in charge without raising their voice. Miranda nodded, mouth tight, realizing that every command she had given, every assertion of authority, had been overridden not by volume or threats, but by the unassailable quiet of presence. Clara's eyes swept the cabin once more, noting every live stream, every recording, every subtle twitch of emotion, then settled on Victoria. She did not rise, she did not shout, she did not gesture. She simply existed in that seat, and in doing so, commanded the room. Victoria slumped, slightly exhausted, defeated, her aura of entitlement drained. Miranda's hand hovered over the intercom, but she refrained. Julian remained still, arms folded, acknowledging without words the inevitability of the situation. Passengers' whispered phones captured every angle. The cabin held its collective breath. Clara allowed herself a subtle shift, a slight tilt of the head, enough to convey authority, without aggression, enough to let everyone understand that this was not a threat. It was inevitability. The engines hummed, steady, unchanging, but the air in the cabin was charged with the knowledge that control had been redefined. Every observer knew that entitlement had been tested and failed. Every action of resistance, every attempt at dominance had collided with authority that was calm, precise, and absolute. Clara exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders, but keeping her posture perfect. Her mind was already moving forward, planning the next steps, documentation crew, follow-up passenger records, and operational verification. The cabin had witnessed justice delivered, not with spectacle or anger, but with control, precision, and quiet inevitability. Victoria turned away, slightly defeated, glancing at the passengers around her. They understood. They had witnessed the collision of perceived power and real authority. They had seen a lesson in humility, in respect, in the measure of influence that comes from knowing your true position. Clara rested her hands lightly on the tablet in her lap. The engines continued to hum. The lights cast gentle reflections across leather and glass. The plane climbed steadily, leaving New York behind, But the echoes of authority, of quiet command, lingered in the cabin like a pulse, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that true power did not need to shout to be recognized. The young flight attendant, notebook in hand, exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Julian exhaled. Miranda slumped into a seat near the galley, acknowledging silently that the storm had passed, because it had never been chaotic for Clara. The passengers settled, some whispering, some staring, all aware that they had been witnesses to something extraordinary, a lesson in presence, patience, and authority that would linger long after the flight landed. The cabin lights dimmed further, shifting from warm amber to a cooler, more clinical glow as the plane leveled at 35,000 feet. Clara Kingston leaned back in her seat, fingers resting lightly over her tablet, the screen illuminating her calm, measured face. Around her, the cabin had returned to a tense equilibrium. The passengers who had witnessed the confrontation with Victoria St. James whispered quietly, exchanging glances that spoke of awe, relief, and disbelief. Every pair of eyes in the first-class cabin seemed to hold the unspoken acknowledgement authority had been asserted, and it had been absolute. Victoria remained slumped in her window seat, platinum bracelet glinting faintly under the cabin lights, eyes darting nervously between Clara and the cabin crew. She had attempted to muster defiance, but now she was frozen, the realization settling in every assumption she had made. Every bit of entitlement had been dismantled by the quiet certainty of a 27-year-old CEO in a grey hoodie and joggers. Miranda Cole moved carefully down the aisle, attending to passengers, while stealing glances at Clara, her jaw tight. Julian Hayes stood near the front arms, crossed the lines of tension still visible on his face, recognizing the meticulous control Clara held over the room, without a word, without a gesture beyond the subtle adjustments of her posture. The younger flight attendant, barely 23, remained in the aisle, notebook in hand, her eyes wide as she recorded every nuance, every ripple of power that moved invisibly through the cabin. Clara shifted slightly, glancing at the overhead panel to check the remaining flight time, noting the subtle movements of the crew and passengers. She had observed, calculated, and accounted for every variable, from Miranda's hand hovering over the intercom to Victoria's trembling grip on her bag. Her mind raced, silently anticipating every possible reaction, planning contingencies for any escalation. A soft cough drew her attention. A man in row 3 leaned slightly forward, his tone cautious. "Are you really the owner?" The question, whispered but loaded with recognition, carried weight throughout the cabin. Passengers began to exchange quiet nods, some lowering phones, some recording, some merely observing. The awareness spread like a subtle current, moving across leather seats, polished tray tables, and crystal glasses. Victoria's panic grew, her lips pressed tight, her breaths shallow. She had been a master of projecting confidence, of asserting dominance, but now she realized that projection had no effect. Clara's calm, measured authority rendered her gestures her status and her words impotent. She opened her mouth, searching for a retort, a threat, any maneuver that might regain control, but no suitable words came. Clara finally spoke, her voice low and deliberate, cutting through the ambient hum of the engines. "This flight is under my authority. Every passenger, every crew member, every protocol will operate according to the rules I set. You assumed power, you did not hold, and you failed." Her words carried across the cabin with the weight of inevitability. They were not loud, but they were final. Miranda paused mid-step, hand lightly brushing the sleeve of her uniform. Julian exhaled slowly, arms tightening across his chest. Even the seasoned crew could feel the shift. The flight attendants had been trained to manage disputes, to handle entitlement, but Clara had rewritten the rules simply by being who she was. Authority did not need to be shouted. It only needed to exist unflinching and unchallenged. Victoria's voice cracked. "I've flown first class for years. Platinum. I know the crew. You can't." Her sentence faltered, swallowed by the sudden awareness in the cabin. The whispers of other passengers grew slightly, capturing the subtle drama. The unfolding truth, the quiet humiliation of someone who had assumed superiority without knowing the full picture. Clara leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the cabin, observing the reactions, the subtle shifts in body language, the way passengers angled their phones to record the slight tension in Miranda's shoulders, Julian's tight jaw, the youngest flight attendant's wide eyes. She did not move abruptly, did not raise her voice. Her calm was a force, steady, precise, unyielding. The door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Edward Sanders, 58, stepped into view again. His expression, neutral, voice, steady. He carried the weight of experience, yet even he seemed to hesitate at the quiet authority radiating from Clara. "We will proceed with the flight once verification is confirmed," he said. His eyes scanned the cabin, briefly meeting Clara's, recognizing the certainty in her stance. Victoria attempted another surge of entitlement. "Captain, this is harassment. Her words were interrupted by a soft, deliberate movement from Clara. She lifted her tablet, tapping a message with fingers precise and fluid. Within moments, secure confirmation of her ownership. Her legal authority and her right to occupy the seat appeared on the captain's console and the crew's tablets. The authority was irrefutable. A ripple of awe passed through the passengers. The young woman in 3C whispered to her friend, voice barely audible. She's the CEO." Phones tilted to capture the revelation. Streams multiplied. Notifications pinged quietly. The cabin had become a stage, the drama real, the stakes palpable. Victoria slumped further. The color drained from her face. She had fought, projected, and commanded her entitlement with precision, but it was meaningless against a quiet, undeniable force. Clara's calm, her deliberate attention, her subtle gestures had dismantled every assumption of power Victoria had clung to. Miranda finally exhaled, shoulders sagging, acknowledging silently that the rules she had been enforcing had been upended by reality. Julian's arms relaxed slightly, tension still visible, but awareness present. The younger flight attendant scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture every subtle indicator of authority, displayed without volume or aggression. Clara tilted her head slightly, letting the movement ripple through the cabin like a subtle pulse. She allowed passengers to witness the authority, to absorb it, to understand that this was not a moment of performative defiance. It was inevitability. Her gaze moved to Victoria once more. "Your entitlement ends here. Compliance is not voluntary. It is determined by fact law and operational authority. You assumed otherwise. You were wrong." Victoria's hands trembled. She attempted to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Her attempt to reclaim dominance had failed. Every passenger watching understood the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Clara had not shouted, had not threatened. She had simply been present, observing, executing control, through precision and calm, and in that calm all pretense of authority collapsed. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence. The hum of the engines was steady, the lights gentle, but the energy remained charged. Passengers shifted, some whispering, some recording, some simply observing the awareness, settling deep. Miranda and Julian exhaled, acknowledging silently that the storm had passed, not through conflict, but because it had never truly been a storm for Clara. Clara exhaled slowly, adjusting her hoodie and leaning back in her seat. Her tablet rested lightly on her lap, fingers poised but still. She had observed, documented, and asserted authority without drama, without aggression. The cabin had been transformed. Passengers had witnessed a lesson in power, in presence, in the unshakable execution of authority. Victoria remained slumped, defeated, clutching her bag. Her confidence had evaporated. The platinum card and status she had relied on now seemed meaningless. The lesson was clear. Entitlement without knowledge, without awareness of true authority, is fragile, and even the most confident facade can crumble under the weight of truth. Clara allowed herself a small, subtle smile, almost imperceptible, as she observed the passengers settling. Her mind already raced through the next steps, documenting the flight, following up with the crew, ensuring every action was verified, every witness accounted for. The plane continued its steady climb engines, humming lights reflecting softly on polished surfaces. The flight attendants resumed service, careful, precise, aware now that authority had been demonstrated not through volume, but through quiet, exacting control. Passengers murmured softly among themselves, some leaning toward each other, whispering observations, replaying moments of recognition in their minds. Victoria avoided eye contact. Her face tight, lips pressed together, fingers clutching the armrest. Every glance she had thrown at Clara before now seemed futile, every attempt at dominance meaningless. She had been outmaneuvered not with force or argument, but with calm, precise, and undeniable authority. Clara leaned back, her eyes scanning the cabin one last time, noting the positions of every passenger, every crew member, every phone recording, every subtle shift in energy. Her presence had reshaped the cabin's balance, and the lesson was clear. Power and authority could exist quietly, invisibly, and when executed correctly, it could reshape perceptions and command respect without a single raised voice. The young flight attendant in the aisle exhaled slowly, lowering her notebook, awe clear in her expression. Miranda and Julian shared a look, silent acknowledgement that the day's events would be discussed for months. Passengers lowered phones, sipped champagne, and adjusted in their seats, but no one forgot what had happened. Clara's hands rested lightly on the tablet, eyes closed briefly. The plane hummed steadily beneath them. The cabin returned to its rhythm, but the echoes of authority and the collision of entitlement and true power lingered in the air, subtle, indelible, unforgettable. The storm had passed, but the lesson remained. The cabin had settled into a fragile rhythm, the hum of the engines a constant undercurrent beneath the quiet tension that lingered. Clara Kingston sat in seat 1A, her grey hoodie slightly rumpled from the earlier confrontation, but her posture was immaculate, controlled, deliberate. Every passenger within sight could feel the invisible authority radiating from her, a weight no argument or entitlement could counter. Victoria St. James, still trembling, sat frozen in her adjacent seat, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a lifeline. eyes darting nervously to Clara and the surrounding crew. Miranda Cole moved through the aisle again, voice low, directing passengers and offering services with mechanical precision, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Clara as if seeking approval or permission. Julian Hayes lingered near the galley, his stance rigid, noting every movement, every glance. Even the youngest flight attendant, barely 23, stayed near the rear notebook in hand, capturing the subtle signals of dominance Clara exerted without a word. A murmur passed through the cabin as a passenger in row 3 discreetly whispered, "She's calm. Too calm. That's the kind of presence you don't argue with." Phone's tilted streams continued comments, scrolling rapidly as observers began to grasp that this confrontation had become a live demonstration of authority in motion. Clara's gaze swept the cabin, noting every phone, every wide-eyed passenger, every subtle body shift. She catalogued, assessed, and recorded in her mind, aware that each person was both witness and participant in the unfolding lesson. Victoria tried again, voice shaking thin with desperation. You can't. This is my cabin. I've been flying first class for years. Platinum. You don't understand." Her words faltered as she realized that every attempt at intimidation had failed. The calm in Clara's demeanor absorbed it all, rendering her entitlement hollow and fragile. Clara's lips curved into the faintest smirk. The movement slow, deliberate, visible only to those paying attention. She leaned slightly forward, eyes meeting Victoria's with an unspoken verdict. "You assumed power you did not possess. Every claim, every threat, every attempt to assert dominance has failed. The rules, the authority, the facts, they are on my side." Her voice was quiet, yet it carried through the cabin with absolute clarity. Passengers leaned forward, some whispering softly, some adjusting their phones to capture the subtle theatrics unfolding. The young woman filming in row 4 whispered into her headset, "This isn't just a fight over a seat. It's something bigger, something real." The realization rippled silently among the onlookers. Miranda cleared her throat, attempting once more to restore order. "Ma'am, please let's proceed with service. Everyone will be comfortable, but I need cooperation from all passengers." Her words, carefully measured, were lost beneath the silent authority Clara radiated. Julian exhaled sharply, recognizing that no procedural command could counteract presence of this magnitude. Victoria's hands trembled, clutching her bracelet tighter, the platinum card between her fingers, suddenly meaningless. She opened her mouth to speak, but Clara's slight tilt of her head, subtle and deliberate, silenced her. It was not a threat. It was inevitability. The entire cabin felt it. Entitlement, wealth, and status meant nothing in the presence of unshakable authority. A soft ping from Clara's tablet drew her attention. She tapped it lightly, sending a secure message to her assistant and the airline operations team, confirming the details of the confrontation, documenting witness accounts, timestamps, and boarding manifests. Every detail had been recorded, every potential escalation anticipated, every action accounted for. She had turned a moment of personal confrontation into operational clarity, and the weight of that was palpable. Passengers exchanged glances, a mixture of awe and disbelief passing between them. The man in row 3 adjusted his tie, leaning slightly toward his companion. "Did you see that?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten anyone, and yet everyone knows she's in charge. His companion nodded, eyes wide. Phones continued to record silently, streams multiplying as the story traveled across social media with rapid, unstoppable momentum. Victoria's face was tight, lips pressed together, eyes wide. She had attempted every form of dominance she knew. Volume threats, appeals to status, but every tactic had been dismantled without effort. She was frozen, stripped of authority, witnessing the quiet demonstration of control that Clara exerted effortlessly. Clara shifted again, leaning back slightly, allowing her presence to ripple through the cabin. Her dark eyes scanned Miranda and Julian, assessing their emotional states, noting the subtle tremors of uncertainty in Miranda's fingers, the slight exhale of realization from Julian. Even the youngest flight attendant lowered her notebook briefly, absorbing the scale of what had just occurred. Then a subtle murmur rose from the rear of the cabin. A middle-aged woman in row 5 whispered to her husband, voice low, trembling with disbelief. She's the CEO. She owns this airline. Passengers shifted, some turning phones discreetly to capture confirmation, others whispering. The energy of acknowledgement spread like a tide, imperceptible but relentless, sweeping across every row. Victoria's breathing quickened. Her hands clutched the armrest. Her voice quavered as she attempted to assert herself one final time. "You can't. This isn't." She broke off, realizing that words would not pierce the quiet absolute force Clara projected. Every gaze, every camera, every subtle movement of the cabin now reinforced the truth Clara was untouchable here. Clara finally spoke again. Voice soft, deliberate, a calm blade slicing through tension. "You assumed control without knowledge, without legitimacy. That assumption has consequences. The flight will continue according to the rules, the procedures, and the authority I hold. That is all that matters." Miranda exhaled, shoulders sagging a reluctant acknowledgement. Julian adjusted his stance, realizing that the authority he had been trained to uphold was now operating on a level beyond procedural control. Even the seasoned crew felt the weight of Clara's presence, the quiet, meticulous command that required no escalation. Passengers began to relax subtly, though awe and curiosity lingered in every corner. Phones lowered for a fraction of a second, then lifted again, capturing the subtle tension, the quiet triumph, the authority in motion. The cabin had become a living study of power perception and the invisible dynamics of control. Victoria's face drained of color. Her attempts at intimidation, her entitlement, her projection of dominance, all had failed. Every observer in the cabin understood the lesson. Authority is not about shouting, about gestures, about privilege. It is about presence, precision, and unyielding command, and Clara possessed it in abundance. Clara tapped her tablet once more, sending a secure message to her executive assistant and operations team, detailing every nuance, every observation, every subtle movement. The cabin had been observed, documented, and accounted for. The operational implications were immediate. This was not simply a confrontation. It was a controlled demonstration of authority, precedent, and accountability. Victoria finally slumped fully against her seat. Her arms crossed, lips tight, defeated. The platinum card and designer accessories she had relied upon for status now meant nothing. The lesson was stark, immediate, and indelible. Entitlement without awareness of true power is fragile, and even the most confident facade can crumble under quiet, deliberate authority. Clara leaned back in her seat, resting her hands lightly on her tablet, eyes closing briefly. The engines hummed steadily. Lights reflected softly on polished surfaces, and the plane maintained its course toward London. The cabin had witnessed a collision of perception and reality, a lesson in presence and power that would echo long after the flight landed. Miranda moved silently through the aisle. Julian followed, and the youngest flight attendant exhaled, notebook now closed, absorbing the experience. Passengers whispered among themselves, some still recording, some processing the magnitude of what they had observed. Clara remained seated, hands lightly clasped over her tablet, her calm absolute, her authority unquestioned. The plane climbed steadily, the lights casting gentle reflections across leather and glass, and the knowledge of the lesson, delivered quietly, efficiently, irrevocably, lingered in the cabin, palpable and unforgettable. The flight had settled into a steady hum, but the undercurrent of tension lingered like static in the cabin air. Clara Kingston leaned back in seat 1A. Her hands folded over the tablet in her lap, eyes scanning the rows of passengers with quiet precision. Every glance, every subtle movement of the cabin crew, every twitch of a wrist or eyelid was noted and catalogued. She wasn't merely observing. She was analyzing, assessing the human landscape around her for the faintest sign of alignment or disruption. Victoria St. James sat stiffly in the window seat across the aisle, hands gripping the armrests, lips pressed together in thin lines of frustration. Her earlier confidence had collapsed like a fragile structure, leaving her exposed and tense. She dared not speak, dared not move too quickly, knowing in some corner of her mind that every action could be measured, judged, and turned against her. Miranda Cole approached the front galley cautiously, clipboard in hand, eyes darting toward Clara repeatedly, each glance a mixture of awe and unease. Julian Hayes lingered near the first-class divider, a quiet observer aware that the balance of authority had shifted irreversibly. Even the youngest flight attendant, barely 23, paused mid-step, notebook in hand, recording notes capturing the unspoken currents of power that flowed invisibly through the cabin. Clara's gaze drifted to the window, briefly watching the patchwork of clouds below, illuminated by the setting sun. The light reflected off the polished surfaces of first-class seats, silverware, and champagne flutes, creating a cinematic tableau of wealth and control. But beneath the luxury, she perceived the microcosm of society's hierarchy, entitlement, and assumptions. Each passenger represented a node in a network of perception and expectation, and she understood every node, every thread. Victoria finally spoke, voice low and trembling with suppressed fury. "This isn't fair. I've spent more on this flight than most people earn in a year. You can't just—" Her words faltered as Clara's eyes met hers, calm, precise, and entirely unflinching. The simple tilt of Clara's chin conveyed inevitability, and Victoria realized that nothing she could say or do would shift the current in the cabin. Clara shifted slightly, tapping the tablet, once a quiet movement that carried the weight of deliberate intention. She had sent another secure message to her assistant, updating the operational team, confirming the cabin's dynamics, and documenting every behavior and reaction. The hum of the plane beneath them seemed almost incidental, compared to the subtle shifts in human behavior above it. A soft cough drew Clara's attention. A passenger in row 3 leaned slightly forward, whispering to his companion, She's in charge. The CEO. She owns this airline. Phone's tilted streams adjusted the murmurs building just below the threshold of audible sound. Each passenger began to feel the weight of observation, understanding that they were witnessing authority in its purest, most controlled form. Victoria's hands clenched the armrests, knuckles white, bracelet glinting under the cabin lights. Her words faltered, desperate, but every attempt at asserting dominance had been neutralized by the quiet, methodical presence of Clara. The platinum card in her hand now felt like a token of irrelevance. She had assumed power based on status alone, and it had been dismantled silently, meticulously. Miranda approached cautiously, offering a polite, controlled voice. "Ma'am, I need you to remain calm. Service will continue, as usual. Everyone will be accommodated." Her words carried procedural authority, but even she could sense that this was secondary to the real control exerted by Clara. Julian's jaw tightened as he observed, aware that the presence in 1A had redefined hierarchy within the cabin. Clara's attention flicked briefly to the digital display above, noting flight time, altitude, and cabin pressure. Her mind worked in layers: operational logistics, human psychology, social dynamics. Each passenger, each crew member, was an input in a complex system. Each action, each reaction, was an observable variable she could leverage or account for. She did not need to speak. Her posture, her controlled breathing, and her subtle movements were sufficient to assert dominance and maintain order. Victoria leaned forward slightly, voice rising despite herself. "This is ridiculous. I've flown this airline for years. Platinum." "You can't." Her words faltered as Clara's gaze, still calm, met hers again. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every observer in first class understood that this was no ordinary confrontation. The woman in the hoodie was not merely a passenger. She was the fulcrum upon which the balance of authority rested. The cabin crew exchanged glances. Miranda's hand hovered over the intercom, unsure whether to escalate or continue service. Julian's posture shifted, acknowledging that traditional methods of enforcing authority were ineffective here. Even the youngest flight attendant, notebook in hand, understood that this moment would be remembered long after the flight landed. Clara leaned slightly forward, voice soft, deliberate, carrying the weight of truth. "All operations, all protocols, all interactions in this cabin will proceed under my authority. No exception, no debate. You assumed otherwise. That assumption has consequences." Passengers shifted subtly, some whispering to one another, some adjusting recording devices, others simply observing in stunned silence. The narrative of entitlement had been interrupted, replaced with the quiet, undeniable assertion of legitimacy. Phones recorded streams multiplied, and the hum of awareness spread imperceptibly through the cabin. Victoria's face drained of color. She tried to form words, but her voice caught. Every appeal, every assertion of dominance had failed against the immutable calm radiating from Clara. The weight of authority pressed invisibly, yet palpably on her. She had been rendered powerless, without physical confrontation, without volume, without spectacle, simply by the precision of presence and control. A soft ping from Clara's tablet reminded her of the operational follow-up she had initiated. She had documented every exchange, every reaction, every subtle inflection, ensuring that there was an unbroken record of events. The cabin had become a controlled study in power, perception, and consequence. Passengers began to exhale subtly, a quiet release of tension. Conversations resumed in whispers. Phones were lowered or angled, still recording, capturing the residual energy of authority asserted. Miranda exhaled, shoulders sagging finally, acknowledging without words the absolute clarity of Clara's control. Julian exhaled, jaw tight, still recognizing the subtle, comprehensive dominion exerted from one unassuming seat. Victoria slumped further, mouth tight, breathing shallow. She had fought with every tool she possessed, status, wealth, entitlement, but none could overcome presence, calm, and absolute knowledge of authority. Every observer understood she had miscalculated the moment she tried to dominate, and now she was exposed, powerless, a lesson in humility, manifesting quietly but completely. Clara rested her hands lightly on the tablet, eyes closing briefly, allowing herself a momentary pause, but keeping her mind active. She planned contingencies, follow-up, communications crew, assessments, and documentation verification. The flight was steady, engines humming beneath them, but the cabin had been transformed. What had been a routine journey had become a demonstration of power, authority, and consequence that no one aboard would forget. The youngest flight attendant exhaled, closing her notebook, understanding that she had witnessed something extraordinary, the assertion of control without volume, the dismantling of entitlement without confrontation, the exercise of power through calm observation and inevitability. Miranda and Julian shared a look, unspoken acknowledgement passing between them that the hierarchy they had relied upon had shifted in real time. Passengers whispered to one another, exchanged glances, some laughing softly in relief, others still in awe. Phones, tilted streams continued. Hashtags proliferated across social media, quietly spreading the lesson beyond the confines of the cabin. Clara remained seated, eyes opening, briefly scanning the room with quiet satisfaction. The engines hummed beneath them, steady, insistent, a reminder that the flight moved forward, even as the social dynamics in the cabin had been irreversibly altered. She allowed herself a subtle private smile. Her authority had been asserted. The cabin had learned the lesson. Entitlement and assumption had been measured and found wanting. Victoria finally lowered her gaze, the platinum card in her hand. Now meaningless, her confidence shattered. She had fought against someone she believed powerless and had been undone not by confrontation, but by quiet precision and true command. The plane continued its steady climb, the city lights below New York fading into clouds and distance. Clara Kingston rested back, hands lightly clasped over the tablet, letting the quiet power she projected ripple subtly through the cabin. The lesson was complete. Observers had witnessed authority in its purest form, the quiet, deliberate, and inescapable power of presence, and the knowledge that entitlement without awareness is fragile and easily dismantled. The plane leveled out over the Atlantic, the soft hum of engines, a steady undercurrent beneath the tension that still clung to the first-class cabin. Clara Kingston leaned back, tablet open, fingers tapping lightly on the edge eyes, scanning the cabin with meticulous precision. Every passenger, every crew member, every raised phone, every subtle tremor in Miranda Cole's shoulders was observed and catalogued. This was more than a flight. It was a theatre of power, a study in human behaviour under pressure. Victoria St. James had curled slightly in her seat, hands clutching her designer bag. Her lips pressed thin, her breathing shallow, the earlier arrogance completely stripped away. She kept glancing at Clara, as if searching for a weakness that did not exist. Every attempt to assert authority, every protest she had made, had been absorbed, neutralized, and redirected by the quiet, deliberate control radiating from the woman in the grey hoodie. Miranda and Julian moved carefully through the cabin, attending to passengers, but stealing frequent glances at Clara. Even seasoned crew members could feel the magnitude of what had unfolded. The youngest flight attendant, notebook now closed, shifted in her seat, staring at Clara with a mixture of awe and disbelief. This was authority expressed without volume, without aggression, yet its weight was undeniable. Clara tapped her tablet once, sending a secure message to her assistant, documenting the events with precise timestamps, noting witness reactions, crew decisions, and every micro-expression she had observed. She had anticipated every possible escalation, and now had a complete record. The cabin's dynamics were under her full control. A passenger in row 3 whispered softly, just enough for his companion to hear. She's the CEO. She owns this airline." The realization rippled silently, yet with tangible weight across the cabin. Phones shifted to capture every angle. Live streams multiplied, hashtags began forming, and the murmurs of awe and disbelief threaded through every row. The cabin was aware now. The balance of perceived power had shifted irrevocably. Victoria's voice trembled, breaking the silence. "I can't believe this. You're just, how is this possible? I've flown this airline for years." "Platinum status, you can't." Her words faltered, swallowed by the suffocating calm of Clara's presence. The passengers, sensing the collapse of entitlement, watched silently. The young woman in 3C whispered into her headset, "Oh my God, she's in charge. She owns the airline." Clara's eyes swept the cabin, noting each phone, each gaze, each subtle movement. She leaned slightly forward, voice low, deliberate. "Authority does not require aggression. Entitlement does not equal power. You assumed control that was never yours, and you failed." The words carried quiet but absolute. The hum of engines filled the pauses, but every passenger felt the weight in the cabin air. Miranda's hand hovered near the radio, uncertain. Julian shifted slightly, acknowledging that the procedural power they had relied on was irrelevant. Even the youngest flight attendant exhaled slowly, understanding the lesson unfolding before her eyes. Every gesture, every posture, every subtle breath Clara took reinforced the truth that authority could exist without spectacle, and that presence alone could command compliance. Victoria's breathing quickened. She tried again, weakly desperate. "I paid for this seat. This is harassment. I demand." Her voice caught the words, failing to regain control. Clara's slight tilt of her head, subtle but deliberate, silenced her once more. Presence, inevitability, quiet authority. These were the instruments that dismantled every attempt at dominance. Clara shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting her hoodie, a controlled motion that carried the weight of observation and assessment. Every passenger who had watched the confrontation now understood this was not a performance, not a show of arrogance or bravado. This was power executed with precision, calm, and foresight. Each micro-expression, each movement, each glance was intentional, deliberate, and observed by Clara. The door to the cockpit opened again. Captain Edward Sanders stepped into view. Voice calm, expression neutral. "We will continue once verification is complete," he said. His eyes briefly met Clara's, registering the absolute authority she projected without a single overt gesture. Victoria's protests faltered as she realized the captain's acknowledgement carried the same weight as Clara's quiet command. Clara leaned forward slightly, voice soft but sharp as a scalpel. "All operations in this cabin, from service to protocol, will proceed under my authority. Any deviation will be noted and addressed. That is all you need to know." The cabin remained silent, the weight of her statement pressing into every passenger, every crew member. Passengers whispered phones, adjusted streams, multiplied, and the hum of awareness spread. The lesson was clear. Entitlement and assumption were fragile. Authority was earned, measured, and absolute when wielded correctly. Victoria's platinum card designer handbag and years of habitual privilege had no power here. She slumped further in defeat, realizing that perception without substance was meaningless. Miranda exhaled, shoulders sagging, finally acknowledging that procedural authority had been upended by presence and legitimacy. Julian stepped back, tension easing slightly, but awareness remained. Even the youngest flight attendant could feel the quiet dominance radiating through the cabin, the kind of authority that demanded recognition without a word raised or gesture made. Clara leaned back, hands lightly resting on the tablet, eyes scanning the cabin one last time. Phones lowered, passengers settled, whispers softened, yet the energy in the room remained charged. She had executed authority with precision, ensured compliance without conflict, and turned a moment of potential chaos into a demonstration of controlled power. Victoria avoided eye contact. Her confidence-erased lips pressed tight. Every glance she had thrown earlier was now meaningless. She had underestimated Clara's presence, authority, and ability to assert control silently and definitively. The lesson was clear, immediate, and undeniable. The plane continued its steady flight toward London. Clara rested back, closing her eyes briefly, allowing the hum of the engines and the soft reflections of the cabin lights to settle around her. Every passenger had witnessed the collision of perception and reality, the subtle orchestration of authority that had dismantled entitlement and arrogance. Miranda moved silently through the aisle. Julian followed the youngest flight attendant, exhaled in quiet awe. The cabin returned to its rhythm, but the lesson remained. Presence could command respect. Quiet authority could enforce compliance and entitlement. Unchecked by reality, would always falter when confronted with true power. Clara opened her eyes, subtle satisfaction in her gaze. She had not needed to raise her voice. She had not needed spectacle or force. The authority in that seat in that cabin had been established, observed and acknowledged by everyone. The engines hummed beneath them. The lights reflected gently across leather and glass, and the lesson delivered remained vivid, indelible, and unforgettable. The passengers leaned back, whispering softly, adjusting in their seats. Phones continued to record quietly. Streams. Continued hashtags propagated. spreading the lesson far beyond the confines of the cabin. Victoria sat silent, defeated, aware that every observer now understood the reality. She had refused to acknowledge entitlement, could not override legitimacy and authority, exercised with precision, could dismantle arrogance without effort. Clara remained seated, tablet resting lightly on her lap, hands folded, eyes scanning the cabin one final time. The engines continued their hum. The plane maintained its course, but the lesson lingered in the cabin air, a quiet, invisible force that would not be forgotten, a testament to the power of calm, deliberate, and absolute authority. The cabin lights shifted again, warmer now, casting gentle, amber reflections across the leather seats and polished surfaces. Clara Kingston sat upright in seat 1A, tablet closed, but ready, her hands resting lightly on her lap. The first-class cabin was quiet, but the energy was taut, still vibrating with the tension of what had just unfolded. Every passenger, from the young couple in row 2 to the elderly man near the exit, seemed to sit on a precipice watching, waiting, sensing that the story of authority and entitlement had not yet fully played out. Victoria St. James sat, rigid fingers clenched around her designer handbag, jaw tight, lips pressed thin. Her breaths came in shallow, rapid pulses. She had assumed she could dominate this cabin with wealth and status, and yet she had been confronted, outmaneuvered, and publicly neutralized by someone who appeared so unassuming, so understated. The dissonance gnawed at her, a subtle, persistent panic that made her glance at every observer, every camera, as if searching for an escape that did not exist. Miranda Cole moved quietly down the aisle, offering services to passengers, but each step was measured, careful. Her hands occasionally brushed the tray tables, adjusted silverware, while her eyes flicked back repeatedly toward Clara. Julian Hayes leaned against the divider, arms folded, shoulders, stiff still, processing the subtle but absolute authority radiating from the young woman in the hoodie. Even the youngest flight attendant, barely 23, had lowered her notebook and watched in awe, absorbing the nuances of every glance, every gesture. Clara's eyes swept the cabin with precision. She observed the subtle shifts in posture, the micro-expressions on passengers' faces, the smallest movements in Miranda's hands, Julian's shoulders, Victoria's trembling fingers. Each micro-movement carried information. Each reaction was a variable in a system that Clara had already anticipated, analyzed, and was controlling. Her calmness was a weapon, invisible, but potent, and unspoken declaration that she held the ultimate authority, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The hum of the engines beneath them became almost incidental, a steady undertone to the more vital vibrations of human awareness. Clara tilted her head slightly, observing Victoria's rising panic. The woman's previously confident gaze had narrowed her composure, fractured a thin veneer of civility, cracking under the weight of recognition. Clara allowed herself a subtle smile, private, imperceptible to most, and returned her attention to the cabin. Passengers began to whisper among themselves, voices low, but charged with recognition. The young woman in row 3 whispered into her phone, streaming to a small live audience. She's the owner. She's the CEO. This isn't a performance. This is reality. Phones tilted, streams multiplied. Notifications pinged softly, and the cabin began to absorb the full scale of the revelation. Victoria tried again, voice shaking but rising. You can't just, you're not supposed to be here. I have rights. I've spent a fortune. This is harassment. Her words faltered as Clara's gaze met hers again. Unyielding, sharp, calm. The weight of certainty pressed upon Victoria, making every argument hollow, every threat ineffective. Entitlement had no leverage here. Clara shifted slightly the movement, subtle, deliberate, and she tapped her tablet lightly. Another message went to her assistant, confirming the cabin status recording reactions, cataloguing every passenger's awareness, every crew member's response. Every contingency had been anticipated. Every potential escalation accounted for. She had transformed the flight from a simple journey into a controlled demonstration of authority and accountability. Miranda's lips pressed tight. She moved down the aisle, carefully maintaining the appearance of normal service, but every step betrayed her awareness that the balance of authority had shifted. Julian exhaled sharply, arms still folded, noting the impossibility of enforcing any procedural power against the quiet dominance Clara exerted. Even the youngest flight attendant felt the magnitude of what had transpired, the delicate choreography of human behavior, orchestrated with nothing more than presence and measured attention. Victoria's hands trembled now, clutching the armrest, her voice breaking again. I've been flying first class for over a decade. Platinum. You can't just sit here and... She stopped abruptly, realizing that no one would support her, that her words were meaningless in the presence of authority she had failed to perceive. Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice low, soft, deliberate but precise. Authority is not assumed. Power is not granted by entitlement or wealth. You assumed control you never held, and it has been corrected. This cabin will operate according to the authority of the airline's ownership and the rules I enforce. That is all. The cabin went silent. Phones lowered slightly, passengers exhaled quietly, and the air seemed to hold a collective acknowledgement of what had transpired. The lesson was unmistakable. Perception and assumption could not override legitimacy, and quiet authority carried weight beyond argument, beyond status, beyond entitlement. Victoria slumped further, a subtle shiver running through her shoulders. She had tried to assert control through volume, through gestures, through appeals to status, but none of it had penetrated the calm certainty of Clara's presence. Every observer in the cabin understood the struggle was over. The authority had been demonstrated, the lesson delivered. A soft ping from Clara's tablet drew her attention briefly. She tapped it, confirming updates had been sent to operations documenting witness accounts, crew responses, and cabin conditions. The situation was contained, recorded, and controlled. Every detail mattered, every reaction noted. The cabin had been observed, the dynamics of power calculated, and the operational integrity of the flight secured. Passengers began to relax subtly. A quiet release of tension, whispers spreading as realization sank in. Some leaned back, eyes wide with astonishment. Others adjusted recording devices, while a few simply exhaled, slowly absorbing the gravity of what had been witnessed. The cabin was no longer just a flight space. It had become a living study in perception, authority, and consequence. Victoria avoided eye contact, lips pressed, tight eyes flicking nervously toward Clara and the crew. She had miscalculated, overestimated herself, and underestimated the presence she had challenged. The platinum card, the designer bag, the years of habitual entitlement, They were meaningless against the certainty of authority, exercised with precision and calm. Clara allowed herself a faint, subtle smile, one that passengers could feel more than see. Her hands rested lightly on her tablet. The engines hummed steadily, lights reflecting off polished surfaces. The lesson had been delivered without spectacle, without confrontation, yet it had been complete and indelible. Miranda resumed her duties, carefully maintaining service, her steps measured, awareness heightened. Julian stepped back, shoulders relaxing slightly, acknowledging the effectiveness of quiet authority. The youngest flight attendant, notebook now closed, breathed a soft sigh, realizing she had witnessed a masterclass in human control, presence, and power. Passengers whispered, some sharing glances, some adjusting phones, some remaining still. They had been witnesses to more than a confrontation over a seat. They had observed the dismantling of entitlement, the assertion of authority without force, and the profound effect of presence on perception. Clara leaned back once more, closing her eyes briefly, letting the weight of the engines, the light, and the cabin settle around her. Every passenger had witnessed the collision of assumption and reality. Every crew member had observed the execution of authority with precision. The cabin had been transformed, and the lesson would resonate far beyond the confines of first class. Victoria remained slumped, defeated, the reality of her miscalculation settling into every line of her body. She had challenged someone. She assumed powerless, only to discover that quiet control, preparation, and legitimacy could dismantle arrogance and entitlement without a single raised voice. Clara opened her eyes, subtly satisfied. The plane continued its smooth, steady course toward London. Engines, humming, lights reflecting softly across leather and glass. Passengers settled, and the lesson had been delivered. Authority exercised with calm precision was absolute, and entitlement unchecked by awareness was fragile, ephemeral, and ultimately powerless. The flight began its descent toward London Heathrow. The city lights growing faint beneath the clouds as the engines hummed steadily, a measured cadence that contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of tension still lingering in the cabin. Clara Kingston remained seated in 1A, her posture flawless, tablet resting lightly on her lap, eyes sweeping the rows of passengers and crew with precise focus. Every micro-expression, every subtle gesture, every glance from Miranda or Julian was observed, catalogued, and silently assessed. Authority had been asserted, but the final act of control was still to come, victorious. And James sat slumped into the window seat, platinum bracelet glinting weakly under the cabin lights, hands clasped tightly around her designer bag. Her face was pale, lips pressed, thin eyes flicking nervously toward Clara, with the faintest trace of fear she had not experienced in years. The entitlement she had relied on, the status she had wielded so confidently, had crumbled completely. Every observer could sense it, and the weight of realization pressed upon her, like the descending aircraft itself. Miranda Cole moved through the aisle again, quietly checking passengers, adjusting service trays. Her movements deliberate but cautious. She stole glances at Clara, whose calm and calculated presence rendered Miranda's usual authority meaningless. Julian Hayes stood near the divider arms, folded jaw tight, watching every subtle movement, aware that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Even the youngest flight attendant, notebook now closed, remained on edge, recognizing that the cabin had been transformed into a stage where presence alone had dictated the outcome. Clara leaned back slightly, fingers tapping lightly against the tablet, a quiet rhythm that punctuated the cabin with authority. She had already sent secure messages to her assistant operations team and legal counsel documenting every nuance, every subtle shift, every observer reaction. The live streams had multiplied hashtags, forming whispers passing between passengers, capturing the subtle but undeniable lesson entitlement could not overcome legitimacy. Victoria's voice trembled as she finally tried to speak, desperation threading each word. "I've spent a fortune on this flight. You can't do this." She glanced around, hoping for an ally among the passengers or crew, but each pair of eyes was locked on Clara, absorbing her silent control. Her platinum status designer attire and years of habitual authority meant nothing against this presence, against this quiet certainty that radiated from the woman in the hoodie. Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile. Private, subtle, imperceptible to most. She leaned forward slightly, voice low, deliberate, carrying absolute clarity. "You assumed control you never held. Every attempt at dominance, every gesture of entitlement has been neutralized. This flight, this cabin, these passengers, the crew, they operate under my authority. That is all." The cabin remained still. Phones lowered briefly. Streams continued quietly in the background. Passengers exhaling softly, the energy palpable. The lesson was clear. Authority was not granted by status or wealth. Authority was asserted precise, deliberate, and undeniable. Miranda exhaled, shoulders sagging in acknowledgement. Julian shifted slightly, accepting the quiet control, and even the youngest flight attendant leaned back. Notebook closed, aware that she had witnessed a masterclass in human behavior and leadership. Victoria's hands trembled against the armrest bracelet, flashing faintly under the cabin lights. She had tried everything: volume gestures, threats, appeals to status. But each tactic had failed. Clara's presence, calm, precise, and absolute, had dismantled entitlement without a single raised voice. Every observer understood the magnitude of what had transpired. The engines hummed steadily, the cabin lights reflecting softly across polished surfaces and leather seats. Clara's gaze swept the rows once more, noting every recording device, every whisper, every subtle shift in posture, each one reinforcing the lesson that had been delivered. Entitlement and assumption had collided with reality and been decisively overpowered by controlled authority. Miranda moved quietly down the aisle, serving passengers, but her steps were lighter now, measured, attentive. Julian remained near the divider arms, still folded, acknowledging silently that traditional hierarchy had been recalibrated. Even the passengers, whispering softly among themselves, were aware that they had been witnesses to more than a simple confrontation. They had observed power, legitimacy, and control exercised flawlessly. Victoria finally slumped fully into her seat, lips pressed, thin eyes fixed on Clara. She realized completely that the authority she had assumed and sought to wield had no weight here. Every glance she had sent earlier, every attempt to assert dominance, every protest, all had been absorbed, neutralized, and rendered irrelevant. Clara allowed herself a subtle exhale, resting her hands lightly on the tablet. The engines maintained their steady rhythm. The cabin lights reflected gently across surfaces, and the passengers settled quietly into their seats. The tension had not vanished entirely. It lingered like a residual echo. But the lesson was undeniable. Power could be exercised silently. Presence alone could command compliance, and entitlement, without legitimacy, was fragile, ephemeral, and powerless. A few passengers whispered softly, phones angled to capture glimpses, streams, continuing to broadcast to the world. The young flight attendant finally let out a quiet, amazed sigh, and Miranda and Julian exchanged a look of mutual understanding. They had been witness to something rare, a demonstration of authority so precise and unflinching that it reshaped the cabin's dynamics entirely. Clara leaned back further, closing her eyes briefly, allowing herself a momentary pause while her mind raced forward, planning the follow-up crew debriefs, passenger notes, operational logs, and documentation verification. The flight would continue smoothly, but every observer would carry the lesson with them long after landing. Victoria's hands tightened around her bag. She no longer dared to speak, to gesticulate, to assert any authority. Her confidence had evaporated completely, replaced with the stark realization that she had miscalculated entirely. Entitlement without recognition of true authority was meaningless, and she had been exposed. Clara's gaze swept the cabin one final time, noting every subtle shift, every passenger's posture, every crew member's expression. She allowed herself the faintest smile, private, deliberate, a reflection of complete control and precise execution. The engines hummed beneath them, steady, persistent, a grounding force against the currents of human tension and emotion in the cabin. Passengers whispered quietly among themselves, sharing observations, exchanging looks of awe, some laughing softly in relief, others nodding in recognition. Phones continued to record streams, multiplied hashtags spread, and the lesson traveled far beyond the immediate confines of the plane. Authority had been demonstrated, entitlement dismantled, and the cabin had become a living classroom in power, control, and consequence. Clara rested her hands lightly on the tablet, eyes opening briefly to scan the cabin once more. The engines hummed, the plane maintained its course. Lights reflected gently across polished surfaces, and the lesson lingered quiet, inescapable, unforgettable. Power exercised with precision, calm, and legitimacy could override arrogance, entitlement, and assumption. The cabin had been a witness, and the lesson would resonate far beyond the flight itself. Victoria slumped fully into her seat. Eyes lowered, lips pressed tight, acknowledging without words that she had been defeated. She had confronted someone she assumed powerless, only to discover that true authority did not need volume or aggression to command compliance. The cabin continued to hum with life, but the shadow of the lesson remained palpable, lingering, irreversible. Clara allowed herself a small, private exhale, the faintest satisfaction in her eyes. The engines hummed steadily beneath them, lights reflecting softly across leather and glass. Passengers settled into their seats, whispers fading to murmurs, yet every observer understood the scale of what had been witnessed. Authority had been exercised flawlessly, entitlement had been measured and found wanting, and the lesson was indelible. As the plane descended further toward London, Heathrow passengers began preparing for landing, adjusting seatbelts, securing trays, and exchanging quiet observations. The lesson in authority and humility had been absorbed. Crew moved efficiently, passengers followed instructions, and the cabin held a quiet reverence for the presence that had orchestrated it all. Clara leaned back once more, hands resting lightly on her tablet, eyes sweeping the cabin one final time. The engines hummed beneath them, The plane cut through clouds toward the runway, and the cabin, though returning to routine, remained forever marked by the collision of perception and reality. Passengers whispered streams, continued phones, angled discreetly, and a young flight attendant exhaled in quiet awe. Authority had been asserted, compliance achieved, and entitlement dismantled. Clara allowed herself the faintest smile, knowing the lesson would linger. The plane descended steadily, engines, steady lights reflecting off polished surfaces, a cinematic tableau of power, consequence, and control. And as the wheels touched the runway, a collective exhale swept through the cabin. Clara adjusted her hoodie, closed her tablet, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The flight had been a lesson, the cabin a witness, and the authority she wielded precise, undeniable, and absolute. Like, subscribe, comment.